coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
For a long time, it was perfectly normal in American politics to assume that the president could remove military officers, especially senior ones, really for any reason he wanted to. I mean, it would have been seen and should still be seen as not quite above board if he removed them for purely, I don't want to call them political reasons because that doesn't quite capture the right thing, but just, petty, capricious, personal reasons. That would be inappropriate. He'd still have the right to do it. And the remedy would be Congress messing with him through the appropriation power or even impeachment at the extreme end. But we've adopted this legalistic view and deference to expertise. And so the press corps and official Washington views something like the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military officer corps as possessing some secret expert knowledge that civilian leadership dare not question. And we would be a little concerned, I think, especially in the modern age, if Trump was questioning tactical staff sergeant level commands on the battlefield. But the idea that he shouldn't be able to remove someone for, quote, political reasons, which we would take in the most capacious sense of a proper view of the American government and its purposes. And that's, of course, the domain of the president. And Brown was not exercising any particular military expert judgment in wanting to push DEI as much as the modern incantation from bureaucrat military types is that diversity is a key to our readiness. I mean, nobody buys that BS, or I hope most people don't. Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the publisher and editors podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. I am joined by Spencer Clavin, resident Dead Poets Society representative, and Mike Sabo. Also, I should mention, everyone knows, but I should mention Spencer is also associate editor of the Claremont Review books. We are putting the new issue to bed almost as we speak, so keep an eye out for that in the coming weeks. Good election coverage and other great stuff. And joined by Mike Sabo, also managing editor of the American Mind. We thought we'd start today with the collective press freakout over the White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt's revelation to the White House press corps that the White House was taking over press permissions from the White House Correspondents Association. That is the WHCA, for those not acquainted with one of the less important acronyms there in DC. But their response, the association's response, was this move tears at the independence of a free press in the United States. It suggests the government will choose the journalists who cover the president. In a free country, leaders must not be able to choose their own press corps. Chuck Todd on X, his response, retweeting that association quip, was, "It's no longer a free press if the president refuses to take questions from anybody outside his handpicked press pool. Will this become a pay-for-play press pool?" I'll bring up, too, the related little snippet of Jake Tapper coming out with a new book, the title of which, with a co-author, the title of which is Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. This led Molly Hemingway to tweet, "The mother," it's always nice, she keeps it clean on X. She's a good Lutheran mother of 2 daughters, so I like that she keeps it clean on X, but she says, or writes, "The mother bleeping audacity of you to do this after running 24/7 interference on behalf of him and mocking and attacking every single person who noticed Biden's decline. The mother bleeping audacity. Have you no decency? Have you no shame?" And there's been some receipts on this, people reposting on X of Tapper, I think in 2020, talking to one of the Trump family members who said that Biden was clearly suffering from cognitive decline. And Tapper responded, I think you were mocking his stutter. Yeah. And I think you have absolutely no standing to diagnose somebody's cognitive decline Picture Tapper's righteously indignant face and voice. I would think that somebody in the Trump family would be more sensitive to people who do not have medical licenses diagnosing politicians from afar. So here we are. The two things to take. I'll comment briefly on both. One of these items, actually, both of them in their own way, touch one of the erogenous zones of the podcast here, if I can put it somewhat indelicately. And that
You
is
cannot,
the
Ryan.
notion
You
that
absolutely cannot. Completely forbidden. It's completely out of pocket.
The notion that the White House Correspondents Association, often in collusion with Democratic administrations, most recently and obviously the Biden administration, with a bunch of pre-planted questions and Biden with his little note cards and which reporters to call on and in what order and what general question they're going to answer. The notion that this association is some avatar of an independent and brave press is laughable. Also, just the fact that you can judge it by what they do. I mean, so far, the White House's taking over of press permissions has allowed a lot of the normal outlets, New York Times and all a bunch of the others, and has moved in some room for new media. Little shout out to Blaze Media, which has its first White House press credential ever, with Chris Bedford as their political correspondent in DC. Chris, a proud Lincoln Fellowship alum from the Claremont Institute, and Matt Peterson, former Claremont Institute VP of Education and a frequent host on this show before he went over to Blaze. Matt's editor of Blaze Media, editor in chief of all their print stuff. So this is quite a coup for Blaze. So that's great for them. And so, yeah, I just mean to say the notion that the White House presiding over press permissions is somehow a step down the road to autocracy is silly. I mean, they're letting normal media in, they're putting some new media in. Trump is still taking questions. I think he's taken 1,000 questions in his first month in office. I think Biden took 140 or so. That was, and I'm sure it declined from there. I saw that quoted. So I think they're all doth protesting too much at this point. And then finally, Jake Tapper. I mean, the erogenous zone of this podcast is the notion that somehow there's this category of experts, whether they be people with medical licenses, judging the common sense, obvious fact of Biden's cognitive decline, or that somehow the WHCA is the only blessed and privileged organization to preside over what and what isn't an independent free press. It's all pretty dumb. I think most normal Americans, to the extent that they pay attention to this sort of thing, kind of shrugged and moved on. But the official Washington is all a Twitter about this latest development.
So I'm trying to steelman this argument as I sit here and listen to you and think, like, what earthly reason could these people have to protest? And furthermore, how dare you, sir? As Molly rightly said, how on earth can Jake Tapper sit there with a straight face and say this is the death of the free press? Democracy dies in darkness. And I'm thinking, well, okay, there's no constitutional reason why this can't be allowed, right? This isn't violating some like sacred pillar of Article 2 or 3 or 1 or anything. So I guess the best you could say is that it's somehow violating norms, and that this will lead to a chilling culture where reporters feel they can't ask hostile questions and they can't mix it up with Trump. And the few things about that are just objectively really hilarious to me. For one, Trump loves to mix it up with the lamestream media, as I believe he calls them. This is like his favorite thing. He feeds off of it. He draws energy like a plant from the sun by getting these like ridiculous kind of lib reporters to ask him hostile questions, and then they love it too. I mean, it's a completely symbiotic relationship. And then the other thing is, let's imagine just for a second that there are reporters out there still who are just interested in a story and trying to get a scoop and want to like unearth some big scandal. Is the White House press room where that sort of thing's going to happen? Like was Watergate uncovered by way of like really sharp questions in the White House? Like this is an opportunity. The White House runs this thing. Never mind who picks the reporters. This is a place where the White House doesn't have to take any questions they don't want. Press secretary can answer or not answer, or say like ridiculous word salad as all of Biden's press secretaries did. I mean, this is a post that was once filled by Jen Psaki and then by the broccoli-haired lady whose name I can no longer remember. But I mean, this is like a place of manifest absurdity, which, as you note, Ryan, and as Molly pointed out, has always been carefully curated, was kept on lockdown by the Biden administration. Is anybody really going to catch, like, let's imagine that there's some terrible scandal. Like, you don't find that sort of thing out by like digging intrepidly in the White House briefing room. You go and find sources kind of around the edges, and maybe somebody can write in and think of a counterexample of a time when like this was a really crucial institution for our free press and for like the publicly available information. But I can't. It's always been kind of a showroom, and Trump actually seems to be running it pretty well, as you point out. And the last thing I'll say is that I sympathize intensely with Molly on the subject of profanity. I have my own podcast that's about classics, and a lot of people listen to it are students. And I really, really wanted to quote this week the line from Snakes on a Plane, where Samuel L. Jackson famously says, "I am sick of these mother bleeping snakes on these mother bleeping plane." And I was just like, I can't do it. There's no way around it. But sometimes, you got to sacrifice for your art.
We'll occasionally swear on this show, but I think we all, our longstanding policy is to bleep it out for similar reasons. But yeah, eventually you just became another Pod Save America, where you have like 30-something Dem operators think it's cool to swear. There's also, like, with the teaching analogy, Spencer, it's also, you want to avoid it too because it's cringe. It's like the high school teacher who swore so he could be cool. Same with like young college professors or assistant professors. It's just, you have to have a certain amount of decorum.
It's an act that gets so old so quick.
And also, the other thing about this, if you look at the run of the televisual age, which has given us the modern press briefing, and even an earlier analog, I think this is maybe a long overdue reform to kind of right the ship of the White House coverage and the unlevel playing field between Democratic and Republican administrations, given the slant of the press. I mean, you had the famously fawning press over JFK covering up all of his infidelity because he was chummy with all of them and he was the hot new thing and his politics aligned with theirs. Going back, you have the FDR cover up of his disability. Now, partly defensible considering we were at war, so understandable, but much needed correction, I think. And like, as I said, we'll see how it plays out. I suppose it could get abusive and Orwellian, but reserve judgment till then. I doubt it will, but
yeah, I mean, it's possible. A free press is certainly integral to a self-governing republic. There's no doubt about that. But really, I mean, do what we have today is actually free press in really kind of any respect. I mean, it's really just kind of people fawning all over their fellow regime members, basically pushing the same narrative, pushing the propaganda out left and right. So I think Trump has identified an issue, even though, yeah, he likes to play Ryan, like, back and forth with him. And I think, he's on the phone probably with Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, every other day still. But it's a thing where he recognizes that they are an adversary and he has to deal with them accordingly. Again, you certainly can go too far, but he's recognizing just their corruption. And this just brings to mind Arthur Millick, who's the executive director of the Center for the American Way of Life. He had actually a great essay in a book edited by Michael Walsh that just came out. I think it came out last year, but he has this line where, the absence of a responsible and free press means the coming of a new era, not of establishing social justice once and for all, but of political corruption, governmental mismanagement, usurpations of rights, and national decline, all of which at some point become irredeemable. The transition from democracy to tyranny is facilitated by seemingly free press, which obtains for itself the petty benefits from assisting the government, the career boosts, the access, the doggy treats. But the next phase of the tyranny they help to usher in will make of the press an unwilling house pet. So they are slowly undermining themselves. I think, he wrote that obviously pre-Trump's second administration, but I think there's certainly a lot of truth there. Yeah, I mean, there's no, First Amendment right for AP to have 3 people sitting in the White House press briefing room. Like, that just comes from such a modern kind of understanding of rights. And, like you said, Spencer, I mean, the White House briefing room is really, it's kind of like a drama. It's back and forth. I mean, it's really kind of like what happens in the WWE. It's just kind of really entertainment. It's for people like, Jake Tapper and others kind of play act to kind of act like that they're somehow, some important arbiter of, our democracy. But I mean, it's just kind of really a sham, really, at the end of the day. I mean, it's a carnival. Trump understands that. But these people who participate, I mean, they just don't seem to like understand what's actually going on every day.
Maybe that's the best argument against what Trump has done, is that the entertainment value is diminished by not getting to see Jake Tapper get beat up by a girl. Like, that just seems like it would be really fun. No, but I mean, now that I think more about it and looking at this WCA statement, the White House Correspondents Association, I'm thinking actually there's a good chance that Trump is going to allow a wide variety of reporters, some from the left, some from the right. That seems to be what he's doing. There's zero chance that the White House Correspondents Association was ever going to grant a press pass to the Blaze. So, all told, this is probably actually a move toward greater intellectual diversity. And if anything, it's going to make the White House press briefings more serious, which is something I hadn't even like thought about before. But like, of course, as always, these things happen in context. Like, if this were something that came out of nowhere and the White House Correspondents Association was doing just fine, and they've done a terrific job kind of balancing the admissions and really getting like good hard hitting questions in there. And then suddenly a newly elected president said, I'm taking the reins of this situation and I'm just gonna manage the whole thing myself. Yeah, you might get a little hot under the collar. It probably wouldn't be a 5-alarm fire. But in fact, these are organizations and people, as we've now said several times, who have like completely squandered the public's trust. So, like all the other stuff that Trump is doing, it's a little bit like, well, maybe let somebody else like give it a shot for a change. I don't know. I definitely, the more I think about this, the less I feel like there's really anything to be concerned about.
It also reflects the changing nature of the media environment. I mean, you said these organizations, people, and institutions that have lost trust, Spencer, but also have lost a huge amount of audience. So that new media collectively reaches a lot more Americans than the White House Correspondents Association clerisy does. And so this is a move towards transparency and public accountability in some ways, easily defended as that. So,
You're saying we should expect to see Logan Paul?
Yeah, I mean, it could go too far. Yeah, yeah. If you've got Weasley, Nick Fuentes in there, it's gone too far. But I think Blaze Media is fine.
We're about to get completely pwned on X. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I think too, it's the media not understanding. Look, it's moving from the televisual age, like you said, Ryan, to the digital age, and they are just so wedded to the way things used to be. The man on the box tells you the truth every night. If you don't hear it from him, if it's not regime approved, well, that's obviously a liar, conspiracy theory, and that whole world is just crumbling and it's falling apart. And they're just trying to put the pieces back together unsuccessfully. And this is just their inability to deal with the world actually is the way it is.
Ooh, I have a CRB piece to advertise in connection with this discussion. Ryan, you said I was both associate editor of CRB and the the Robin Williams Dead Poet Society editor of the American Mind. Well, this prompted me almost to want to say Carbe Diem because we're CRB, but then I refrained, and now I'm subjecting you all to this hideous dad joke. But anyway, there's a piece in the new CRB that I am currently proofreading, as you note, by none other than Chris Caldwell. Always great to read, but it's not just an obituary, but kind of a retrospective on the life and times of Marine Le Pen, one of France's, in fact, Chris argues, kind of the originator of the worldwide populist movement, or the man, at least, who has been at its forefront for longest. And this is the sort of thing that you only are going to get in CRB, is like, how do we understand Trump? Well, you have to interview this 97-year-old French politician. But Chris is right about this, and actually has been following this stuff really closely. He speaks perfect French. And he has a whole thing in there about the way that the press got co-opted into the defensive power structures and thereby lost their footing for claiming a kind of independence or this crucial democracy defending role that they no longer can claim. So ClaremontReviewBooks.com coming out soon to a mailbox near you.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up this related issue of Jeff Bezos issuing a statement on X and elsewhere saying that the opinion page of the Washington Post will now be dedicated or stand on the two pillars of personal liberty and markets. And he asked his opinion editor if that was all right. And he said, it's either a hell yes or it's got to be a no. And the guy said no. So Bezos wants to turn, speaking of declining market share, wants to make an effort to draw a larger audience at WAPO, I think, by having less insane op-ed page, which recounts or reminds me of, well, first I'll tell a joke. Ex-commenter at Man Dave Jobgood had this quip about that, which was Jeff Bezos wanted badly to make a Lord of the Rings show, trusted it to a bunch of libtards, and they screwed it up so badly it made him a Republican, which I found pretty amusing. But also there was when Mike Anton left the first Trump administration, he had a brief stint trying out at the Washington Post to be their op-ed writer. I forget who they tried before him, but it hadn't worked out, or maybe they were just soliciting some more balance. And Mike wrote two op-eds, the first of which was America's Full, Why We Don't Need Any More Immigrants, followed by The Case Against Birthright Citizenship, at which point he was asked not to write anymore for the Washington Post opinion editorial page. But he went out in a 2-column blaze of glory, which was quite amusing. I will also point out, we hadn't announced it here yet, but Mike, you're labeling Arthur Millick as executive director of our Center for the American Way of Life reminded me that he is, but he's now on leave because he is Mike Anton's deputy principal director of policy planning, which is like the State Department's think tank for good policy and diplomacy ideas. So Arthur's having a lot of fun. So is Mike. Mike's more senior than Arthur, so he's gotten to travel more. He was on the Latin America trip. He went on the Germany, Israel, UAE, and/or Saudi Arabia trip, and now actually he's going up to Vancouver by himself to represent the United States in some pre-G7 talks. So Mike's racking up the miles, and unlike Hillary Clinton, he's using those miles to actually get some interesting things done, we hope. Anyway, yeah, Bezos, sign of the times. He's been quieter than a lot of tech folks about the state of our politics and more careful. So I think this is probably him just deciding it's now safe to do this without fearing some mass exodus of staff, or at least having the center left Washington shrug and say, oh yeah, I guess so. It makes sense. You got to pivot. But an interesting development nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I think with that move, it makes sense. It makes sense with everything he's been doing, kind of go more, I guess like libertarianish, like Cato Institute, even kind of talking points and that kind of stuff, which is going to play well in I think at least decent amount of corners in DC. And I think, look, this is what he kind of has to do to kind of stay ahead of the game. I mean, in many ways, he's much more far-reaching and understands the world much more than the press does at the Washington Post, the people who've, been there for 20, 30 years, who have been editing and writing for, most of their lives. And so it's kind of interesting that this, tech mogul, who that's certainly not what he does, is kind of more in tune with actually how people think. Again, another massive indictment on the press in the past 20, 30 years. But you look at the Wall Street Journal too, like it all makes sense. It's kind of going more with that kind of ethos. Smart business decision. We'll see how it shakes out. I don't expect any hires, certainly like Michael Anton. That would have been amazing. I didn't realize, because I remember when those two pieces came out, I read them and I didn't realize that they were kind of, he was actually possibly in line for a position there. So that's hilarious. Washington Post readers opened up their pages and spilled their coffee, spit it out on the page, the very next second after seeing those pieces. But in any case, at least there's some more intellectual diversity. They'll be able to encounter some different arguments than just this kind of like amorphous blob DC liberalism. So if that's the case, great.
I guess like one reading of this that I'm potentially taking away is that most opinions are completely fake. Like the entire climate of opinion and the entire atmosphere of quote unquote, how people feel in the country has just shifted utterly. And this obviously reveals something that I guess we suspected, which is that all of these loud protestations in defense of DEI and wokeness from the corporate world were totally craven and profit driven and had everything to do with getting on the right side of the people in power. But it really drives home like the way that it quote unquote seems everybody feels is like almost purely a confection, especially in America, where we care very much about profit and we have this like heavily market driven series of incentives. Like the feeling that we all had in peak woke 2020, that there was this giant mob like surrounding us with these deeply held woke convictions, like that was all totally imaginary, which just makes it much more satisfying to have sort of ignored it and carried on saying what we're saying in good times and bad. It also, of course, means that we can't rely on guys like Bezos not to change their tune again when power changes hands. But it really is a kind of astonishing to realize that you're sitting in what you think of as a climate of opinion, and then it's all an imaginary creation. It's all a funhouse. It's all a confection.
Yeah, quite right. Interestingly, you bring up the Wall Street Journal, Mike. If WAPO has a conservative op-ed page and a very liberal press section, it would be almost identical to the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
Which, a lot of people miss, because a lot of our friends just get it and read the op-ed section and are occasionally shocked to learn that a lot of the reporting is not exactly neutral, but actually quite left-wing just because of the personnel. Yeah, so interesting things afoot. And we wanted to talk about another thing that's set the media and official Washington on edge, which is what we're calling cleanup on aisle DOD. That is Department of Defense. Secretary Hegseth has removed the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman C.Q. Brown, who has been under fire from the right for years since his nomination, a couple of years ago, I think it was, because Brown, among other things, was a DEI champion, oversaw the implementation of an explicit racial pilot quota system at the Air Force, and has been bad all along. Our colleague Will Tebow, who's the director of our American Military Project, the goal of which is to get wokeness out of the military and meritocracy and excellence back into it as defining ideals, has written a piece at the American Mind, which I encourage everyone to read, sort of laying out the case for why Brown should have been removed, and it's good that he was. It's called President Trump Was Right to Fire C.Q. Brown. Hegseth also has a bunch of other generals on his list, has removed some of them. And the typical response is this from Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts. Quote, dictators or wannabe kings fire generals who don't agree with their politics. This isn't a banana republic. What Trump and Hegseth are doing is un-American, unpatriotic. It's the definition of politicizing our military. We should expect that loyalty oaths, not to the Constitution, and worse, are coming soon. This is, it's kind of a piece with the response to the president's and the AG's asserted control over DOJ, in that for a long time it was perfectly normal in American politics to assume that the president could remove military officers, especially senior ones, really for any reason he wanted to. I mean, it would have been seen and should still be seen as not quite above board if he removed them for purely, I don't want to call them political reasons, because that doesn't quite capture the right thing, but just, petty, capricious, personal reasons. That would be inappropriate. He'd still have the right to do it. And the remedy would be Congress messing with him through the appropriation power, or even impeachment at the extreme end. But we've adopted this like legalistic view and deference to expertise. And so the press corps and official Washington views something like the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military officer corps as possessing some secret expert knowledge that civilian leadership dare not question. And we would be a little concerned, I think, especially in the modern age, if Trump was questioning tactical staff sergeant level commands on the battlefield. But the idea that he shouldn't be able to remove someone for, quote, political reasons, which we would take in the most capacious sense of a proper view of the American government and its purposes. And that's, of course, the domain of the president. And Brown was not exercising any particular military expert judgment in wanting to push DEI as much as the modern incantation from bureaucrat military types is that diversity is a key to our readiness. I mean, nobody buys that BS, or I hope most people don't. This objection from from Moulton. First of all, removing generals, even for political disagreements, is as American as apple pie and has been for a long time. Everyone, I don't know. It's just this response from Washington is to get all hyperventilatory about any exercise of common sense or practical judgment by political leadership when it goes against their accepted norms and precedents, some of which are like DEI in the military, at least in its current iteration, racial and sexual identity, not more than a hot minute old. I mean, Will Tebow has documented, and I encourage everyone to go check out the report called Identity in the Trenches about DEI in the military. I mean, it really started in the 60s with Bob McNamara and the Vietnam War and others, where they tried to integrate some of the results-oriented goals of the Civil Rights Act and its perverted progeny, that is some sort of pure representation of demographics in the population with military officers in the military and enlisted in the military, et cetera, et cetera. So it did start way back then, but it's gone on hyperdrive since the Great Awakening in 2010, and then on hyper ludicrous speed since 2020 and the summer of George Floyd. So this again is just another welcome correction. And I'll just find closing point. Will likes to tell the story of the beginning of the end of competence as the major consideration in the military, as being the beginning of the end of that old regime was really the Clinton administration. I mean, Bill Clinton wanted open homosexuals to be fine serving in the military. They settled on a don't ask, don't tell after he got basically the resignation letters from his top generals on the grounds of unit cohesion and introducing heretofore at least closeted erotic element into all male units. So Clinton lost that fight, and we have changed the military quite a bit since then. One couldn't imagine anything like that now. In fact, Trump spent the better part of his whole first administration trying to get the transgender madness out of the military. And so this, again, is just a welcome corrective to an institution that's at the bleeding edge of national security, literally trying to get back to some sense of meritocracy and excellence over identity.
Yeah, and I just kind of wonder with this, I mean, you look at the military, you look at their record for the past, 20, 30 years. I mean, what exactly do they have on their side, to chalk up, that we have got win after win after win, just massive victories, and Trump is messing this up. He's tearing us down. We can't stand for this. I mean, they really don't have any credibility. Look, the Pentagon, I think, has failed 7, 8 audits in a row. We have a military class of generals who I think have basically never won a war. You look at C.Q. Brown himself, and again, he might be a very nice man. I'm sure he is. I mean, to make it 4-star general in the Air Force, there has to be some accomplishments, some skill involved there. But as he was on Charlie Kirk a few days ago, he pointed out, you look at him and you have the all these medals and merits and everything that he's wearing on his uniform. And then you say, look at Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Command. I mean, won World War II, and he's got maybe 1 row of medals, and that's about it. So, I mean, we've just puffed up this kind of leadership class in the military without really remarkably any kind of, wins, victories, battles to their name. And this is kind of the result of that. Trump is recognizing that. Pete Hegseth is recognizing that. And they know that massive changes need to happen. The guy who they picked, guy named Dan Caine, he's a lieutenant general in the Air Force. So really kind of a different kind of profile than C.Q. Brown. He was the guy who, I think Trump said this, basically looked at him and said, hey, you were basically the guy who spearheaded the defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And, Will says even in his op-ed today that, Caine understands that the sole purpose of the military is not for these kind of ideological experiments. I mean, it's for victory. It's peace through strength. It's to defeat our enemies. And that these things need to happen to do that. And we need to overturn, again, a political class that extends to the military who have not been successful, and that we need a change. And this is just logical. This is what presidents do when they see failure.
Yeah, the reporting on this has been so dishonest. I mean, it has shocked even me. The aforementioned Jen Psaki said something to the effect of, well, it's bad optics because he's only the second person to be nominated to this position who is black, which, besides being just like brain dead and racist, is also plainly not Trump's concern. I mean, even leaving aside whether you think that's a grotesque way of thinking about people as I do. It's just not what's on Trump's mind. And it doesn't address the matters that, for example, Will Tebow and Ryan Will via you has been raising on this podcast. Again, these things are not happening in a vacuum. This isn't something that Trump just woke up one day and he decided he wanted like unilateral control over the military. This is something he can do. I mean, I have yet to see or hear a good constitutional argument why it's not allowed. Are there, as with the press thing, like, can you imagine dangers? Yes. And I get very antsy when it comes to the military. I'll be honest, because it is the classic political philosophical example of the thing that leads to a coup or a regime failure is when the military and the state are at odds, or there's some question of loyalty conflict between individuals versus the law when it comes to the soldiers. Like the guys that hold the guns call the shots, so they need to be devoted to the laws and not to a person. I understand all of that. I get why people are like raising those concerns, but he is the chief executive, and this is part of his job. He's totally allowed to do it, and he's not doing it for flippant or personal reasons. He's doing it because this is because in fact there has been a serious threat to the integrity of the military from the other side, namely the incorporation of woke dogma into military regimes, practices, etc. It's been a long time coming, as Ryan said, but it's been particularly egregious under Biden. And if there's anywhere that you want a hard reset to reestablish the principle of meritocracy, it's surely in the nation's defense. So it truly does not wash. And this stuff about how it's because he's black. I think on Pod Save America they had said something about it's like his crime was speaking about his experience as a black man in America in the wake of George Floyd, or maybe that was the Slate Political Gabfest. I can't remember. One of these lefty podcasts. It's just, again, just like completely beside the point, and like a totally dishonest representation of the kinds of concerns that are going on here. Is it delicate? Yes, a lot of this stuff is delicate. Is Trump like rampaging unprovoked through the like very inner sanctum of our constitutional order? Definitely no.
And if the shoe were on the other foot, the left would expect in a heartbeat an incoming Biden or Shutter, God forbid, Kamala administration. You know, if there were some controversial, fairly recently implemented and aggressively promoted, as they saw it, unconstitutional or suspect right wing ideology, and take some right wing, analogy to DEI. Who knows? Maybe meritocracy. They'll do it the next time. They'll remove the Joint Chiefs guy who's committed to meritocracy and excellence because somehow it's racist, sexist, and homophobic and transphobic. They wouldn't raise a peep at all. So it's just another example of the uneven playing field, which has been a theme of the beginning of the first half of this podcast in general, and their freak out on all this stuff. I guess, in a certain way, I'll tweet occasionally about the insanity of the left and put in parentheses ho hum. It's my way of winking at our right wing audience that, yes, I know this is not some great revelation and we shouldn't be righteously indignant about it, or we should be, but to raise it as somehow alarming kind of misses the time that we're in, because it was alarming a decade ago. So we got to talk about it somehow differently. Here's to a
Didn't Jabba the Trans like become an admiral under Joe Biden? Like,
Jabba the Trans. Yes,
Rachel Levine. I'm talking about Admiral Rachel Levine.
Yeah, the fake title that you get at HHS somehow, even though I don't think Mr. Levine ever served in the military. But if he has, I take that back. I just don't know. Anyway, I hear that recruitment numbers were up for the first time in a long time recently. So hopefully Hegseth can turn this sucker around. I would commend to everybody, if you haven't listened to it, very interesting, about an hour-long podcast on the Larry Arnn Show, where he sits down with Hillsdale alum Eric Prince. A lot of people don't know he went to Hillsdale, but he did. Graduated, I think, in the late 80s. And Prince has some very interesting things to say about how Taiwan ought to approach its own defense. He recommends a home guard, which is a throwback. He talks about how having private military contractors is as American as apple pie and even predates the Constitution and Declaration. and other very interesting things. But his thing about the Defense Department was, it could take a 20% haircut or maybe even a 30% haircut pretty easily. And he's just talking about readiness. They don't get into DEI really much, but a little bit. But he's talking more about readiness and this absurd procurement process and just the sclerotic nature of old bureaucratic generals and the collapse of confidence that used to be more prevalent in the military, of confidence in staff officers, sergeants, and people on the bleeding edge of combat, as Eric Prince says, a place he knows pretty well as a former Navy SEAL. And he even recommended, which I think is a great idea, beefing up significantly the National Guard and really cutting back tremendously on our standing army, which would be in line with founding principles as well. And it would, in the meantime, solve this problem of recent wars, which is way too much centralized control from the Joint Chiefs and the top of the command at the tactical level, and the bureaucratization of war, and how it's led to what Mike described as the inability of anyone to win a war in a very long time. His Afghanistan example is that the original proposal from the Defense Department was 45,000 troops and like a full occupation. And luckily, the CIA and Rumsfeld's crew said, no, we're going to insert some special operators and a few hundred guys, and with air support. And they basically took out the Taliban in a few weeks. And unfortunately, it then got taken over by the bureaucratized military, and then we were there for 19 more years. So there's your kind of division between the real expertise, that is the expertise on the ground, being nimble and able to react to wartime, versus the way we do so many things in modern American life, which is kind of managerially. I've raised it before, and I'll stop after this. I've been ranting. John Marini, great sage of Claremont and critic of progressivism, he said, well, it's no wonder we don't win any wars, because the bureaucracy and its managerialism and its mindset has seeped into government in general. So why would they want to win a war when they can manage one for 20 years? That's what they do.
Jeez, you just send every high-ranking official in the military an email saying, describe the 5 battles you won in the last week, or whatever.
Yeah. list one battle or war you've won in the last 4
right
days.
And just have like Pete Hegseth just in the shadows like RFK and say, hey, what have you done for us lately?
I think probably they shouldn't do that, just to be clear. That sounds like a bad idea. But
yeah. Mike, I think you're describing the meme of RFK where he says, send me an email with to the American people with the 5 things you ate last week.
Yeah. Right.
Well, we're also in budgeting season in the U.S. government. It was sort of a close run thing. This is the budget framework that will guide the reconciliation process between the House and the Senate as they try to get a budget in front of the president in the coming months. I read quite a few kind of Politico pieces and stuff about the last 3 or 4 days saying Johnson's difficult math in the House. They were skeptical that Johnson can get it done. He's managing various factions, including this fairly significant rump of hardline fiscal hawks in the House GOP delegation that really want to try to get a handle on the debt, and that's a perfectly honorable thing to be worried about given its size. And Johnson at the end pulled a rabbit out of the hat, and every member of the GOP caucus in the House voted for this budget framework, except for Thomas Massie. Those of you who know how Massie operates should not be surprised by that. He's in an R plus 30 district out of Kentucky, and just refuses ever to vote for anything that adds to the deficit. So that was perfectly predictable. But with a 3 to 5 seat margin, depending on who's in town, it's a pretty remarkable achievement. It looked like it was not going to go. And then Trump apparently was working the phones on 3 or 4 sort of moderate, much more competitive district members. And Johnson and Trump prevailed to whip the caucus and get this budget framework passed. It's a mix of old line conservative tax cutting. It's just really extending the Trump tax cuts, but also has some populist Trump campaign promises like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security benefits, and no tax on overtime. The Democrats are wailing because it's fiscally irresponsible, because it will wipe out a bunch of revenue with those extended tax cuts. And the GOP has vowed, and I think Trump had tried to reassure a couple of his wavering members that they are going to take a very hard look at cuts to offset all this stuff. I think Trump's hope is probably that Elon can deliver on 1 trillion. I still remain quite skeptical of waste, fraud, and abuse and firings totaling up to 1 trillion, but Godspeed, Elon and Doge. But now it heads to reconciliation. So that will really be the devilish details, is how the House and the Senate hammer this out. In the Senate, of course, they can give away 3 votes, I think, maybe 4 if you include Vance as a tiebreaker. Don't quote me on that math, but we're right around there. And they're doing it through reconciliation, so they do not need to clear the filibuster 60-member threshold to get a vote for it. So this is Trump's big, beautiful bill, as he keeps calling it. It's got a bunch of energy policy stuff in there that Trump's been talking about, setting energy markets free to run wild and try to bring down inflation by increasing gas and extraction and resource exploitation and all the rest. And this newly arrived at deal with Zelensky will probably help a little bit, where we agree to have 50% of the rights to Ukraine's rare earth minerals and other stuff. I think there's a few other items on there. Well, yeah, of course, border security, more ICE money, DHS money, and border wall money. ICE money is like it's like the immigration hawks version of beer money. You know, you need that ICE money.
A little change. Yeah, here's a quarter. Go buy yourself a nice fence. That's funny. Yeah, go see a Star Wars. I mean, it's funny because like there's sort of 2 levels on which these sorts of conversations happen now. There's the level on which you sort of accept the context that we are spending obscene amounts of money all the time and constantly in debt, and at some point are going to have to reckon with that. And if you just sort of like acknowledge that nobody seems to want to do anything about that, then it's like, yeah, this is seems like a good budget bill. You know, it seems like I hope they can kind of get it through. And then there's the protest vote version where you're like, there is no version of a budget that is good unless it addresses this insane deficit. But we've talked about this before on the show. It's like now is probably not the time when we're gonna make these cuts. I'm more bullish than I think you are, Ryan, about the prospects of Doge, although it does seem recently like they're starting to scrape bone a little bit and hit up against stuff that actually you can't do away with. But you definitely don't want to rely on Elon delivering on 1 trillion, like as your only plan for addressing the budget deficit. All that having been said, it's like Trump's agenda, broadly speaking, is what people expect him to do. It seems like time actually for him to get the focus away from Doge a little bit and onto addressing some of the border stuff, especially, which this would help him to do if it finally makes its way through. So that seems like it would be good. There is this like lingering problem with prices, which I don't think it's Trump's fault exactly, but it is one of the things that I think the majority of his voters sort of expect him to fix. And it's been turned in very cleverly into a meme by the left that people voted for Trump because they wanted cheaper eggs. And there's just enough truth to that I worry about Trump's approval rating if prices continue to soar, and the tariff stuff might kind of cause that in the short term, at least, to happen. Anyway, these are all very hazy predictions for even somebody with a lot of economics knowledge, and I am not somebody with a lot of economics knowledge. I just think like there's probably no great solution here, but it's definitely a win. It's just a win to pass things. It's a win to like get progress for your agenda. That's kind of my sense of it.
Yeah, egg prices are definitely not coming down anytime soon, considering the U.S.'s largest egg producing farm just had to murder 5 million chickens because of bird flu. So again, it's just Trump's bad luck, at least on the egg price front. And Doge, they're doing all sorts of good stuff. This is an example, but this does not even add up to a rounding error on a rounding error. But they're auditing all these departments and finding tons of waste, of course, which is a shock to nobody. This is just from the Department of Labor. They found 380 Microsoft 365 licenses with 0 users. I think an annual license for 365 is probably $130 or something, maybe more. 128 Microsoft Teams conference room licenses with only 30 rooms that they were installed in. 250 VS Code licenses. I don't know what that is, but they're only using 33. 129 Photoshop licenses. Those are like $500 a year, I think. Only using 22 of them. 5 cybersecurity licenses, each with about 20,000 seats. And the Department of Labor headcount is lower than 15,000 people. So there's tons of this to pare back, and it will add up to some significant, 100 million here, 100 million there, but that's a long way to go to 1 trillion.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I don't know how we actually get out of our fiscal problem. I mean, it's just amazing kind of considering, I mean, we had balanced budgets going through, what the early Bush administration, I think that, with the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, it's where it started to kind of separate, and it's just widened and widened and widened. I mean, if you even look at, I think 2019 compared to now, I think we're talking about like an extra $2.5 trillion actually. So it's insane, just the acceleration. It's kind of like a logarithmic scale now. It's just, you just don't know kind of where it can end. I mean, obviously with the US kind of being the, reserve currency and everything, kind of propping up, basically every other nation, and other nations being so involved in what we do. I mean, if we were to bottom out, it would be a worldwide catastrophe, but you just don't know where it ends. There's that old quote, there's still a lot of ruin, but you just don't know quite how much there is. But Trump has to start somewhere. Chip Roy, representative from Texas, he just kind of talked about, really detailed, obviously, what was in the framework that's going to be going to committee. But he said, really, he ended up voting for it. I think he's kind of known, as a fiscal hawk. I mean, not quite like Massey, but still kind of on that same level. He talked about an effective discretionary spending freeze that accounts for future emergency spending, the full eradication of Green New Deal IRA subsidies, and the termination of Joe Biden's student loan bailout, among a bunch of others. So that's obviously included in this too. I've been seeing a lot where Trump's no taxes on tips, and that was supposedly included, but I guess people kind of went through the language and found that's not there, at least in this current framework. So hopefully that'll get added in some way, shape, or form in committee at some point. It's not really anything, honestly, to be probably that excited about in the long term. Obviously, it's a short-term political win for Trump. He shows, he's in control of the House. I think he'll show he's in control of the Senate too. So those are important for political imagery, and, shows his hold over the GOP, which is certainly in a far better place than it was in the first go around in 2017 when they pushed through the tax cuts. But, we'll see what happens. You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I think that if this had failed to pass the House, it would have given a lot of comfort to Trump's enemies. And so for that reason alone, it's got, as you say, Mike, like a lot of political value. Like it redounds always to the favor of the left if Trump looks kind of, if it looks like there's internal dissension in Trump's Republican Party. And again, like getting things done, having things that you can point to is really helpful. And yeah, I just return to like, if you accept the premise that we are sort of free falling, careening uncontrollably toward this debt disaster, then this is a good budget. And it does seem as if that is a premise we simply do have to accept for all the reasons that we've covered already before. I hate even talking about this because it's not the sort of thing that you want to raise as the specter of a possibility, but it does seem like one very likely outcome of the whole debt thing is that it doesn't get addressed until there's some sort of major crisis, especially since Trump is not interested in touching benefits, Social Security, that sort of stuff. This is something which ironically he may have to pay a certain political cost for, even without doing it, because of the like Elon with a chainsaw at CPAC type imagery that makes people think he's cutting grandma's SNAP benefits or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's just nobody willing to pay that political price right now. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I'll just this is like my third or fourth shout out in 2 years or more for Chris Demuth's essay in CRB from years back, Trumpism, Nationalism, and Conservatism.
At least it's not Ungovernable, the book Ungovernable.
Yeah, I've moved on and moved back to Demuth, and a big section in that essay. Just Google Trumpism, National Conservatism, and Claremont Review books, and you'll find Chris Demuth's piece. Demuth, former president of AEI, but before that, a staffer in the Nixon administration. So he's been around a long time and has thought about this stuff. And he just talks about the political intractability of really doing anything big about the debt, long-term debt, right for now until a real crisis comes. So he admonishes Republicans to prepare to have a good plan when the crisis comes, when it will. Okay, let's wrap up with I at least have a recommendation. You guys can or cannot. We're not going to do it every. Maybe we'll end up doing it every show now, but we're doing it a little less all American mind and just around what we're reading and interesting stuff, and even what we're watching. But this is I just wanted to flag this because he's a friend of Claremont. John Asconis's new piece in the New Atlantis. You, dear listeners, especially OG listeners, have heard James Poulos talk about the televisual age and the digital age and all that stuff. But Asconis here has an essay, The New Control Society in the New Atlantis, that tries to explain how the transformation that has been wrought on us and on our politics by the internet is shaping everything. And it has to do with the nature of communication and management and the state of our souls and how all sorts of stuff. But John is a close student of all this. He's a professor at Catholic University of America, very smart guy, and it's a very interesting piece. And it's something that maybe the average American Mind listener hears about in passing or reads a Twitter thread on, but hasn't done a little nice little, not a deep dive, but a medium dive on it. But Asconis is great, so go read it.
Yeah, my recommendation is at the American Mind. It's our put it up on Friday. It was the weekend long read piece, J. Michael Waller. It's called Gutting the USAID Industrial Complex. And it's just a great, really deep dive into USAID, how it started, how did it turn in from basically from a Cold War mechanism of US soft power to basically propping up kind of the modern regime that's currently in power. How did that shift happen? What took place? Who are the players? So it's just a really, really great read. Waller himself, I think, was in USAID in the 80s and 90s, so he had a front row seat to all of this. So please read it. It's up on the one of the editor's picks right now.
Those are both great pieces by great authors who are always good to watch. My recommendation is a little bit out of left field, but it's so cool. I just had to share it. So, okay. Last summer, a team of researchers at Harvard took a 1 millimeter square chunk of brain matter. So this is like about the size of a mustard seed of the brain. And they just put it under an electron microscope and they mapped it. The result is it's 1.4 petabytes of data, which if you've never heard of a petabyte, as I never had before I looked this up, it's one of those like imaginary sounding numbers. It's 1 quadrillion bytes, otherwise known as the number of bytes it would take to record Lawrence of Arabia in 4K 34,000 times. I think I did the math, but I forget exactly what I came out with. It's also the kind of unit in which you measure like how much data it takes to train a state-of-the-art large language model. So this is like the sorts of numbers you use to gesture at the sum total of all human knowledge in one mustard seed size item of the brain. And the images that they got are freely available online. So you can look up an article in Science called A Petavoxel Fragment of Human Cerebral Cortex Reconstructed at Nanoscale Resolution. Maybe we'll link to it in the show notes. And then you can scroll through all of the like weird structures they found, half of which they have no idea what they are. Some of them are like neurons and they understand them. And then some of them it's just like an unidentified egg-shaped object that nobody knows what it does. They are as alien and mysterious and majestic as the images that came back from the James Webb Space Telescope. They are every bit as complex and mystifying and magisterial and miraculous as like the farthest reaches of outer space. And again, in like one corner of the brain. And I think this is actually really important because we are so prone to talking casually about like quote unquote mapping the brain. Oh, they're mapping the brain. Like they know where all your emotions and your limbic system and everything lives. It's like we have no clue. This is the most complicated object in the known universe. And yes, there are serious philosophical objections to the idea that even if you had mapped it all, you would understand like consciousness or the soul. But before you even get into that, like just to take stock of the astonishing wonder work that is this thing within between your ears, and the way in which it unfolds into, as William Blake might say, the world in a grain of sand, is just like, to me, marvelous and an actual a good use of science. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, as I am, go check it out.
I didn't know about that, Spencer, so thank you. I will go check it
Sure.
out.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. I will say, though, it's motivated research on your part. It's just your continuing quest to prove that God exists. And I'm all for it. So,
Yeah, guilty as charged. So terribly, I apologize for wanting God to be real.
oh, good. Well, we've run a little over, so I will wrap that up and thank everyone once again for listening to an episode of the Roundtable. I will drop a plug, though, if you haven't checked out our Cincinnatus series. It's now 4 episodes. We're doing them. We recorded the day before this, so they usually drop on Wednesdays. This drops on Thursdays. And it's just a limited run series where we try to talk through some policy issues to help state legislatures start to think about intelligently and hopefully legislate intelligently on issues like family policy or education policy and the classic domain of the state. So go check that out. I think we have 2 left. The one we're recording next week is on cell phones and kids and usage and all that. And we have on some guests who know some stuff about this sort of thing. Anyway, thank you for listening. As always, if you want to learn more about all our work, go to claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. Go to the ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Keep an eye out for the new issue, which will drop digitally before it gets in your mailboxes, probably in a couple weeks. That is in digital form, maybe a week and a half, if we're lucky. And go to dc.claremont.org to check out all of our work on state policy, national policy, and all that good applied Claremonsterism. And rate, review, like the show, help spread the word. And thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next week.